Very good. We'll start. I suppose the public want to come in if they wish. Yeah. We'll start the Q&A session now, and the public are welcome to come in. Hmm? Yeah, well, yeah, I will. Go ahead. Yeah. All right. We have the roving mics as per usual, and so put your hand up if you have a question, and I'll take the first question. I'll take the question from one of the tables now. This is table 2.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 2. There's 3 questions here from the table. The first question is for Dr. Michael Collins, and it is in relation to pension schemes. Is money being taken out unnecessarily in relation to fees? And is this going to become, or is this a mini industry where money's been taken out purely on fees for handling the money? Secondly, will private pensions begin to replace the state pensions, or will they work alongside each other? And thirdly, in relation to the fate in the government, how does trust be put in place that pension funds will not be touched? And it was suggested by members of the table that a possible constitution amendment should be included to stop the raiding of pension funds in the future. Cheers, thank you.
Yes.
You want to answer straight away?
Yes.
Thank you. On the fees issue, it's sort of an uncracked nut, I would say, in terms of that. We're aware that there's significant fees in there for private pensions. It's not particularly transparent. There are fees on the way in when people put money into pensions. There are management fees within it. And then there are also fees within the pension structure itself when the money is being managed and, say, asset A is being sold and asset B is being bought or whatever in the management of the pension scheme. It's not particularly transparent, and there are various, Jim Stewart and Trinity College has done some work estimating what the pension fees are. The pensions industry, who in a sense should know this, haven't been overly transparent as to what it is, but there's clearly a lot of fee income within there. And what's striking for Ireland is that we have an awful lot of pension schemes. So Andrew mentioned earlier that once Britain has left the European Union, if they eventually do that, that we'll have 90% of all the pension schemes in Europe. And that's because of the way we structure our pension schemes. I was at a seminar recently where Dutch pension researchers were talking about the really hard work of the Dutch government to reduce the number of pension schemes down to 3 in that country. We're in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pension schemes. There are inefficiencies in there with that as well. On fee income too, it's worth noting that if we talk about, let's keep the numbers round, 100 billion euro of assets that are in there being managed in pension schemes, well, at a management fee of 1% of that a year, plus charges for fees coming in and flowing or being managed within the pension scheme, it's an enormously lucrative area for pension schemes to operate in. We certainly need greater transparency on that, and if we were to go down the auto-enrollment route, there would be I think it would be really unacceptable from public policy perspective that it wouldn't be clearer as to how that money is being managed, particularly often when you would be pulling in individuals on lower incomes who really couldn't, and I think Liam highlighted this point, who couldn't really afford to see their savings being diluted by large levels of fees. And on the second part of the question there as to whether private pensions will replace the state pension or both would sustain, I think you can take it that both will sustain, that they will have to. I suppose the ideal one might imagine is that everybody who's working will begin to save more for their pension in retirement, and therefore there'll be a lot more private pension income around. But of course you've got a large number of low-income workers for whom it may not make any sense at all to save for a pension. So if you take the replacement rate of, say, 50%, and let's again do some round numbers. If we say the state pension is €12,000 a year, so let's double that to 24, let's call it €25,000 a year. Anybody earning less than €25,000 a year, it doesn't make any sense for them to save for a pension because they will get the state pension of just over €12,000 in retirement. So that's a reasonable cohort of the population or of employees who are below those income levels. It's only upwards and on from that then that replacement rate issues come along. So I think we can take it that both would remain, and I think, as I pointed out in my presentation and is in the paper, it will, I would expect, for the longer term that the main source of pension income, as is the case now, right into the future, will be the old age pension.
Yes. Would any of the other speakers like to make an observation? Yes.
If I just can, just on the fees, there was a report on fees done by the Department of Social Protection and ourselves in the Pensions Authority and the Central Bank back in 2013. It's a 350-page report. If you can't sleep, download it and read it. Yeah. You'll be asleep in a page or two. But in broad terms, I'll save you the hassle. Smaller schemes pay higher charges. And that's part of in the authority's view, we want a smaller number of large schemes. Smaller schemes pay significantly more higher charges, and the predominant size scheme in our system is very small, and certainly very small by international comparisons. So the more members in a scheme, the lower the charge, and that's a finding from that report in 20.
Is there any regulation of fees, any statutory regulation of fees?
Standard PRSA has its charge capped at around 1.2%. That's the maximum charge you can have, and essentially that becomes the de facto charge. But in terms of other statutory bars, there's none. So it's very much the trustees of a scheme should be aware of the charges they're paying.
Alan, yes?
Yeah, just on the issue of fees, I mean, one way around this is to bypass the pensions industry and to change the current state pension into an earnings-related system. So this is a proposal which, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about. I'm not necessarily championing this myself, but I think it's an interesting notion. I mean, when you think about it, the biggest pension provider in the country is the government. Yeah. They do this remarkably efficiently. The Department of Social Protection sends out a huge amount of checks every week, and they do this really, really well. There's economies of scale here. And so when we talk about second pillars, whatever like that, I mean, one simple approach to this would simply to be expand the system that we have, turn it into an earnings rate, so you don't just get the flat rate, you would get through the PRSI system that you would get an earnings related pension, so it would cut down dramatically on the fees, and it also takes an awful lot of risk out of this, because when you think about it, the state, hopefully, apart from the odd time here and there where it nearly goes bankrupt, tends to be able to manage risk over time, so there would be a certainty around this. This is sort of a broader social value, and I've said it's a proposal that I first heard about 10 years ago, and I've always thought it had a certain appeal. Yes.
Is it something that has been considered?
It is certainly something, let me put it like this, it has been proposed.
Well, I was thinking about by the powers that be.
Well, I think the powers that be have always been slightly scared of it, and here's the reason. If you're in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, while obviously the payments would be coming into you, I think there's always a fear on the part of government that if the contributions being made are not enough to fund the ultimate expenses that are going to accrue. And you can imagine in a political system where there's an awful lot of pressure to increase the rate of payment, that you could have a disconnect. So when I've had discussions about this with people, the group who have tended to oppose it, well, the pensions industry, that's not a surprise. Yeah. I think the Department of Public Expenditure, I'm not going to say they're opposing it, I think they've always been slightly uncomfortable about it, but it's something that they're aware of.
Yes, thank you very much. I just ask the question or the comment in relation to a constitutional amendment to stop raiding of pension funds. By whom?
The members have suggested a constitutional amendment to stop the government from raiding pension funds.
By the government,
by the government in the future.
Yeah, very good. Right. Yeah.
Can I?
Yes.
Sorry, Dave, and member on table 11. To Professor Delaney, regarding the SMART programme, after the specified maximum, as example of 13.6% is reached, would the contributor have to make overpayments to the scheme to make up for the shortfall of initial lower payments?
Okay, so with something like SMART, I mean, really, with any sort of defined contribution pension, you put in your money, you build up a pot, and then depending on what happens to the assets, that's what you retire with and you use for your retirement. So there wouldn't, for most of these schemes, there wouldn't be any sort of compulsory. It's really just the framing of it to get them to that level. You could envisage doing it in such a way that the contributions would go higher. I mean, 13.6% is an interesting number because that's roughly where the Australians put it when they're opting people into compulsory pensions. Now, some actuaries would say it should be higher if you wanted to fund. If you wanted your retirement income to be, something like 3/4 of your highest income, it probably should be a bit higher. But the answer to your question, it really would depend on what money you wanted in retirement. So it wouldn't be, and I think in terms of auto-escalation or save more tomorrow or whatever you want to call it, the advantage of it for me would be in an economy like Ireland that has tended to sort of overshoot both sides economically. If you are going to go through a period of economic growth, it would be a way of saying to the population, look, we want to move you up to a higher level of saving as the economy is growing so that you can build up money either through PRSI or through the private funds, and that way you'd bank some of it. It's just to finally answer your question, the answer is no. You wouldn't have to compel people then to overshoot on the other side. In some sense, the 13.6% is like an overshooting of what the 8% is going to be that's being proposed.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Yes, I'm the facilitator for table number 6, and the citizens at this table have 5 questions.
Yes.
First one being, currently the contributory pension is $238.30 per week, which is 35% of the average income. If this is increased to 37%, what would the weekly figure be? And if this is achievable, given that 75% of the population rely on it, what is the time frame for this? Will I continue with the questions? Are the panel aware of, if any, proposal to address the anomaly between the current existing, between the retirement age of 65 and the age of entitlement to the pension? The next question would be, should the non-contributory pension be index linked to the cost of living? If it was possible to remove the mandatory retirement age of 65 in law, would this invalidate any employment contract with the provision of those other legal mechanisms that would allow this possibility without disruption to the contract? And finally, in Dr. Collins's paper, he outlined that it would cost more to live in rural Ireland. Should the state pension reflect this fact?
Can I?
Yeah.
I'll come in on those 5 easy questions. Let me try. Just on the first one, on the contributory pension, and if you were to increase it to whatever benchmark, what's stopping us doing that? Well, there's nothing stopping us doing that, and that the government could do it in the next budget if it wished. It would have to pay for it. And so there is an issue where you get the resources and where you either collect those resources from or take those resources from. So there's a choice here, and fundamentally the policy decisions here are really around splitting up a certain pie of resources among different areas of society, including among pensioners. So we could do it. I didn't pull out my phone to start doing the quick calculations. It'll be possible to do it. Certainly I'd be of the opinion that there's a lot of merit in pushing up the state pension, of keeping it linked in some way to average earnings, which comes back to that sort of relativity point so that older people don't slip behind. But in doing so, I think we have to look at where we're spending money elsewhere and save it, and I would have thought that probably points us towards reducing some of the expenditure we have on tax reliefs. The rural Ireland question at the tail end, I'm a Clare man originally, and this would go down very well in Clare to suggest that we could have higher rural Ireland pensions than in urban Ireland, but that's not going to happen. So no, I think there's a state pension which will be for everything. And why is it more expensive to live in this is at a minimum standard of living in rural Ireland than in urban Ireland? Well, that's actually principally to do with transport issues and public service issues and so on as well. So there are other areas, in a sense, for action on that, and the solution isn't necessarily to have higher pensions for those groups.
I just wanted to make one point about the index linking. There's a very interesting idea, which I don't think is, it might have come out in some of the papers, but it didn't really come out in the presentations yet, what they call notional defined contribution pensions, where the growth of the pension pot is sort of linked to the growth of the economy. So, I mean, the idea behind it is it's A, to keep it sustainable, because as Alan said, it's pay as you go, and B, it's to sort of encourage people to go towards more productive economic policies and so on. So in other words, if you're in the population, your final pension will be some function of how the economy has sort of done over your lifetime, which means if you lived in a period of relative growth, you'll get more. Again, maybe it could be too complicated. It might even be perceived as unfair if you talk about it in certain ways. But I just wanted to put it out as an alternative to just simple index linking. Broadly, I'm like Micheál. I'm in favour of making sure that the state pension grows in line with the expectations. But rather than just index linking it, doing it as a function of productivity and growth has a lot of desirable features. And there's been a lot of very big folks in these literatures advocating for that.
Yes. The age gap, I don't think we addressed that, the question about the age gap. Yeah.
Let me try and say something brief about it. The age gap, you know, the fact that you can only now get the state pension at 66 and a lot of retirement happens at 65, yeah. It's not as severe as it actually sounds, because really for an awful lot of people who have fallen into, let's call it the gap, what has happened is that rather than getting the old age pension, yeah, they've been able to get job seekers benefit. Yeah. Now, that's, you know, running at the moment. The bigger issue comes in 2021, when the pension age is then moved out to 67, because then, of course, given that job seekers benefit, I think, is only paid for about 9 or 10 months, then you have got a gap. So there's no doubt there is a disconnect, I think, going on here. I mean, I think the government's argument on this would be partly that even if your company pension says, you know, you got to go at 65, there's nothing stopping you technically from going and getting a different job. Okay, we don't have a mandatory retirement age in Ireland in the sense that you're not allowed work beyond a certain point or anything like that. So I think it's really trying to get some sort of a renewed connection between the sort of standard social welfare model that's out there and a lot of employment contracts. And I think there was another question in there about, it was more legal, and I'm not sure.
It was about whether there would be a breach of contract, isn't that it?
That's correct, yes.
If the mandatory retirement age.
Would you like me to read it again?
Yeah.
Okay. If it's possible to remove the mandatory entitlement age of 65 in law, would this invalidate any employment contract with the provision that there are other legal mechanisms that would allow this possibility without disruption to your contract?
Yeah, well, I suspect the answer to that is that there wouldn't be retrospective legislation which would interfere with existing rights. Is that likely?
I'll defer to the lawyer.
I mean, that is it's a complex legal issue, and I think you'd need to look at the particular circumstances involved. But my instinct is that it is unlikely there would be legislation which would retrospectively interfere with a person's contractual rights. Yes, yeah.
We certainly looked at it back in 2010 or 2011, and I suppose the difficulty is there isn't a retirement age in existence for the country, so it is employment by employment, contract by contract, so it becomes extremely complex in terms of overwriting however many thousand contracts of employment. Yeah, so I know that doesn't really help
Yeah.
but it's half an answer.
Yeah, it could be done prospectively, I think, yeah, that regulations introduced that would apply in the future. But I think that there is a problem there, and you'd have to look at each case individually, I think. Yeah. Would any
Hi, I'm a member of Table 8, and the table has a question for mainly Andrew Nugent, but any of the other members of the panel can come in on it if they want. And then I have a comment or a statement from myself for Justice Lafoy, Sharon, and the floor. And so the question is for Andrew Nugent is, some young people probably have hesitance in starting a pension as they will have multiple jobs over their lifetime. Hence, there would be multiple funds on different employer schemes for the worker. How easy is it to access or carry forward these funds into your overall pension when you retire? And then the comment or statement for everyone else is, I'm concerned about the focus of the Assembly's work being entirely based this weekend around pension and retirement policy. Given Eamon O'Fergal's moving testimony at the last meeting that the care of Alzheimer's and dementia patients in an increasingly ageing population is of such a huge cost and challenge to the state, then there should have been a greater focus given by the Assembly and should be given by the Oireachtas to the care of these people. Given that we will be voting on varied topics this weekend, then I think the speakers, and no offence, so close to the voting should be of a similar nature to the voting topics. And I actually have a hidden agenda. So my mother has dementia as well and requires 24/7 care. So this is why I think Eamon O'Fergal's testimony was and is so important to our deliberations. And this bears on the fact that there's a number of new members here this weekend which wouldn't have seen that testimony, wouldn't be able to take into account in their voting. Hence, I would ask my colleagues at the last meeting to remember the testimony, and I would ask my fellow citizens, the new ones here this weekend, to look at it on the website as well. And then I think if they'd taken that into consideration, we'd all agree that elderly people, people with age-related conditions and their carers need a much greater level of support from the government. And one recommendation I would suggest, and one alteration to the ballot paper, is that the government make a commitment to family carers to provide an income, pension and education opportunities for them, as outlined by Eamon at the last meeting.
Thank you very much. We'll make a note of that. The multiple jobs was the question in relation to this particular topic that we're on today. Yeah.
Okay, so it can be an issue where people have multiple jobs and multiple pension pots. The rules around them are after 2 years in a pension scheme, your money is vested. In other words, you can't get it back until retirement. Subject to the rules of any scheme, you should be able to transfer your previously saved funds into your current pension scheme. So it is possible, but like everything Micheál mentioned, there are fees and charges that will come out. So it is a little bit complex. It is doable. You certainly wouldn't need a PhD in economics. It mightn't help. It mightn't hurt, should I say, rather than help. But it can be done. So the current legislation allows you to move funds from pension scheme to pension scheme. And clearly, I suppose, part of our view of the need to reform the system is to have larger schemes that make it much easier and cheaper to do that. But it is possible.
Yes. Anybody else like to make a comment? Yes, Alan.
Just very quickly, but it's another argument in favour of doing it to the PRSI system.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it doesn't matter who you're working for, you pay PRSI,
Yeah.
and you get that continuity built into the system then.
Just like to say on the long-term care issue, I mean, I watched the online videos. A lot of the discussion around pension, as you correctly point out, it's a qualitatively different issue with long-term care, but there are similarities in terms of the complexities of this, and even look at things like the confusion around fair deal, which, I mean, if you're very minded and you're administratively and legally sort of trained and so on, you could look at it in a certain way, but I think we need a lot more work in long-term care to clarify people's options as they're getting up to certain ages, and among the carers as well, present much more clearly the information. I think a lot of the issues we have in pensions, you see them much more starkly in long-term care because it's so visceral, but some of the issues are very similar in terms of just this is literally long-term. People don't like thinking about it. You've got this tension between like some countries are opting people into long-term care insurance versus, you know, should the state just simply come in and put in much more blunt fixes to some of these issues. But I think pretty much everything I'm saying about the pension case I would apply with caveats to the long-term care case as well.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 3. The citizens at this table would like a question directed to the panel. How does the state pension relate to the minimum wage, and should there be a direct linkage between the two?
Micheál, I think.
Don't rush.
You're on the hook for this one, Micheál. Go on.
I should have brought my calculator.
Yeah, it went up to 11.30. What was it during the week?
No, so the
minimum wage.
Yeah, so three things then. So the minimum wage is €9.25 an hour. The living wage, which you mentioned then, was $11.70 an hour.
Yeah.
And then of course we don't pay the state pension. We pay it on a weekly basis. I mentioned the figure over €230. They're not really related. The benchmark, there isn't a benchmark for the state pension, but it roughly aligns, as Andrew pointed out, to it was 35% of average earnings. So we have average earnings figures, and it aligns to that. It's an interesting question as to whether, if we're thinking about the income of older people in retirement, whether we as a state might make a commitment that the state will always give you via the old age pension, perhaps we would say it as the contributory old age pension, so it would reflect the contributions, a figure of 35% of average earnings, so that there's an alignment and a guarantee for somebody in their 20s or their 50s or their early 60s that they know, looking into the future, that there is at least this guarantee of a pot there. So that's probably the best way of thinking about it in terms of that link to average earnings, but it isn't in any way tied down. And it's an interesting challenge as to whether we should, I would think we should, tie it down. Alan mentioned earlier the civil servants in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform who would have heart attacks at the idea that we would make such commitments. But public policy is about sort of figuring out what are the things for the state to do, and after the civil servants have their heart attacks, we move on nonetheless and implement the policy. So the choice is about making those policy decisions, and I think some type of benchmark of that nature would be very sensible.
Alan?
Yeah, just a quick remark on it. I think one of the reasons we haven't explicitly benchmarked pensions is that the minister loves getting up on the day of the budget and saying, I am increasing pensions by X amount. So you can imagine if there was an automatic increase, he or she wouldn't have that particular joyous moment. And it is as simple as that as to why. In reality, pensions have, and I think again this came out of Micheál's figure, pensions have actually tracked wages pretty well. They've sort of exceeded them in some of the recent times, and that's why the poverty rate has come down. But can I say, to the extent that you would make any proposals, it should be around the indexation to wages. Don't do it to prices. All right, or the cost of living, because that will mean over time pensions will fall relative to earnings. And to the extent that the core thing we want to achieve here is that the pensioner group are sort of tracking what's happening in earnings generally. And again, you don't want to match it to the minimum wage, because again, that's a sort of a political decision that happens periodically. So say if you got a government who was sort of opposed to the minimum wage, it could be cut. So again, you want to avoid that. So indexation to wages, and if you want to be really mean and take the fun away from the minister, push it.
But are you saying that using the average wage as a yardstick rather than the minimum wage is a better device?
Absolutely, because again, you want to anchor it to the sort of the average in the population. The minimum wage is a very, very specific group, and I think that's not the route you want to go down.
Yeah, thanks very much. Any other questions?
Judge, I'm the facilitator for Table 12, and I have a couple of questions for the panel. The first one is between Andrew Nugent and Alan Barrett, as there's some conflict. Andrew Nugent states, at present there are 5 people working for each pensioner and will decrease to 2 to 1 by 2050. How is this sustainable? Alan Barrett stated that public pension costs are sustainable. I have 2 questions for Liam Delaney. Are there fees in a mandatory pension as distinct from auto-enrolment, and are they managed by trustees? And what's your opinion on a similar scheme to the SSIA for pensions? And my last question is for Micheál Collins. Using property to supplement their pension, is this used in other jurisdictions?
Will I try and reconcile our conflict?
I wasn't aware that we were.
No, I think the answer to the question lies in the following form. So it's absolutely the case that if you just track the numbers in the population, okay, Andrew's numbers are absolutely right. But if you think about it, economies tend to grow over time partly because productivity increases. Okay, so if you go back, say, over the last 20, 30 years, and if you think in terms of output per person, okay, it has grown enormously, and then average wages have grown enormously. So Andrew's figures are absolutely correct. The figures that I was using from the Department of Finance would use the same population figures, but they'd have built into it an expectation that output per person would grow over time. So although you've got fewer people supporting an older population, they are producing more. Okay, so the economics of it are not as stark as the population figures. So I think that's the sort of mathematical answer.
Yes.
And the property supplement question, I'm not aware of it in too many other countries. I know the Dutch have been attempting to align it into their pension system somewhat. Ireland, you know, is particularly unique in terms of our scale of home ownership. Now it's decreasing, as you'll have seen from the last census, and that'll probably continue. But nonetheless, we've a very. It's how we keep our wealth, as that survey showed, we are large homeowners in terms of proportions of our population. It seems to me a bit mad, to be honest, that elderly people die and leave huge amounts after them relative to their standard of living in the years up to their death. That's just passed on to another generation, and that in a sense for the last 10 or 15 years of somebody's life they're sitting in an asset which they just leave after them, and it is of no the wealth in that is of no value to them. Clearly it's in value in terms of passing on for inheritance, and what I'm really trying to suggest here is that we shouldn't look past the fact that there's a big bank of wealth there into which we could tap, and that doing that carefully, and I think that's why it has to be done by the state, so there isn't any sort of profit motive driving it, or indeed fee income driving it, or anything else, but that there's potential for us to tap into that to, in a small way, assist people to use some of that resource, in a sense, get back some of the savings that they've made over their lifetime. It means their estate will be smaller at the end. For the state, actually, it means the inheritance taxes it collects might decrease in the end. But in the medium term, it means that those people are able to use some of that asset. And I think we haven't really thought about this in public policy terms before, because we didn't really know a lot about it until we, at least in detailed data terms, until we got that recent data from the Central Statistics Office. Now we know about it, and it seems to me when we're thinking about the income of elderly people, we shouldn't look past the fact that for some elderly people, there's a potential there, which isn't money in pensions, but it is money in an asset that they have and that could possibly be of use to them.
Yes, great minds think alike. The SSIA went through my head. I think it was maybe during Liam's talk. I mean, do you remember the SSIA?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things on. Firstly, I think it's really striking from today and other sort of discussions how popular is the wrong word, but certainly how much people sympathise with the idea of doing this through PRSI. So you asked me about fees. I mean, as Alan said, you know, despite all of the talk about government inefficiency and so on, like our system is very, very good at taking in money and giving it back without huge administrative costs or problems. So, I mean, I think it's actually interesting how much people seem to sympathise with the idea that if we perceive there's under-saving, a simple way to do it would be to do it through the PRSI system and communicate to people that, look, you're paying extra PRSI, maybe even allow them to opt out. You don't have to if you don't want to, but we'll be doing it for your future, and you keep the sort of complexity of multiple providers and all of this stuff out of it. I still think you're going to have a situation where you have to ask yourself, how much do you want the state to do, as opposed to, do you want people to do this themselves in the interaction? So do you get to a level where somebody's making 100 grand a year, and we think the state is there to ensure that they have a top-up when they've indicated by their previous behaviour they don't want one, or they haven't made any decision towards that regard? So, I mean, it's not uncomplicated, but I think it's a very strong point coming out, even of the discussions and the questions and so on, that if we were to bring in a sort of auto-enrolment or mandatory system, that it wouldn't have to be done like in the UK through the workplace into funds, that it could actually be done through the PRSI system. Let me say one thing about SSIA. So, the pension auto-enrolment endeavour over in the UK, one commentator famously called it the biggest social reform in Britain since Beveridge. So that's the scale that you're talking about. You're talking about this massive change in almost the structure of how the state interacts with people to provide for their retirement. And that's how I think of pension auto-enrolment. I think it should be, or whether it's a mandatory system, it should be very, you know, far-sighted politicians and civil servants sitting down and going, this is something we need to fix for 40 or 50 years, and it needs to be done in a principled basis, seriously, and so on and so forth. I don't want to have too much of a go at SSIA type schemes, but they do tend to collect a lot of political stuff. And I've already seen stuff floating around at the moment about like having child accounts and all of these types of things. And I can understand why they would be popular and it'd be lovely things to announce. They also tend to involve a lot of behavioural framing. So you remember the last one, it was if you invest £4, you get £1 back. That was partly because you took all the returns over 5 years and you sort of fast forwarded it into one number. If you'd put it into a mutual fund at the time, it wouldn't have been that much different. It was behaviourally very well framed. So I guess my problem with something like an SSIA is that it becomes a sort of magnet for political communication, and it could even end up distracting from what you're trying to do, which is look at the income distribution across the age groups over the next 40 years and do something that's really sort of robust. I mean, SSIA could end up as basically handing, you know, 5 to 10k to people that are already doing pretty much okay, which is roughly what happened last time, and it won't really have any effect on these sort of big systemic things that you're thinking about. So I'm not necessarily saying don't do it. It could be a useful way to get a defined group of people to save, but I don't think it's a serious sort of structural change that would address these sort of big things we're thinking about.
You're thinking more, am I right, you're thinking more of the PRSI approach? PRSI,
or, I mean, I think it's open for discussion as to whether it's PRSI or whether it's like in the UK where you've got like a big default fund that people buy in an large trust, and then people can choose the other ones if they want to. But it should be bigger than something like SSIA, which is really, you know, there's no real principle behind SSIA. It's a sort of handy way of giving a sort of give out to a group. But it's I mean, if you look at SSA, it didn't have any major change in the Irish economy. It was you wouldn't notice it if you were just looking at the numbers. It was a very contained type of thing. And actually, if you went back to that time period, if you'd had more foresight, or you had more principled policymakers at the time, no offence, but if they had thought about it from a more systemic point of view, a lot of people would have got through the crash with their household balance sheet in a lot better order than, you know, a relatively group of people who were already pretty comfortable, who were given a give out. And I'm not, again, I don't want to say I'm against it. I mean, it's okay, but it's not. It won't solve any of these sort of issues you're thinking about today.
Yeah. Can I just quickly,
Micheál, you want to add?
Just quickly echo on that. I agree with almost everything that Liam said there. It was the most generous savings scheme in the world at the time, and so these things cost money, and we should remember when you put money into these things, you don't have it for something else. We had money falling out our ears, as it were, at the time as a state, which is why we could afford it. We're not there now, and I think we've come to a sort of better appreciation of that there are scarce resources and we need to use them. What was interesting about the SSIA was that it was simple. And I think that comes back to the logic here that if we are going to go down things like auto-enrollment routes and so on, we can't let a repeat of history happen where we have multiple schemes all over the place, and therefore you are talking about very few easy to understand mechanisms which handle the diverse workforce of the modern world, where people move in and out and around between jobs, and that's a simpler structure, and there is an aim for simplicity that's part of the policy response here too.
We've overshot the mark, but I'll take one final question.
I am the facilitator for Table 1. Some of these points have been touched on already, but the table have several points. The first is a question. Given the rise of newer, more temporary and irregular models of employment, such as zero-hour contracts, fixed contracts, indirect agency employment and the like, are these factors being included in the analysis given in the paper so far? A point is made that the process needs to be simplified, in particular relating to the system for managing multiple pensions, and that goes back to the concerns raised in the question. And finally, the table overall would favour auto-enrolment or a mandatory system, but a concern was raised about the need for an ability to pause that in relation to the vagaries of life and the needs of people in life.
Yeah, so in terms of pension auto-enrolment, I mean, just from the point of view of the presentation, I didn't want to go into every nitty-gritty of it, but the point you make about pausing, it's perfectly, you can, what they actually tend to do in a lot of these systems is they'll let you opt out for a year or two, and then they'll enroll you back. And you can pause it. I mean, the other question is whether you should be allowed to draw down some of the money you've saved. And again, the jury's out on that one, in the sense that if you've built up money in a pot, so some schemes will let you actually access it, whereas others, once it's in, you can't go at it till you're at retirement. The point you make about precarious employment is a really good one. I mean, for the most part, that tends to be associated with lower income employment. So what Micheál is saying, the state pension is making up a lot of the slack, but increasingly that's changing. And there's sort of two aspects of that. One is we need to do a better job at measuring employment in the country, so not just measuring the unemployment rate, but actually looking at what the standard of employment and precarity of employment and so on, how that feeds in. And then the second point, there is a lot of literature about how people can understand multiple pension pots. Now, Andrew will have a lot more details about how it's actually structured, but from my point of view, the complexity of it such, I think it's a massive deterrent that people are thinking about, well, what am I going to do to consolidate pots in 20 or 30 years' time? Now, you see in the States, like companies like Fidelity, or I don't want to mention one, but a lot of large companies they offer services specifically where they'll go and get your pension pots together. And in Australia with superannuation, a lot of companies specifically offer that service. They almost compete on it, and effectively they say to you, you know, we will go and find your pots and consolidate them, probably charge you a lot of money to do it, but that happens. But I think those 2 points you're completely right. Precarity of employment and then the complexity of merging the pots need to be on the agenda. It would also, Alan said, I don't want to. I feel we're actually coming down the view that saying that the PRSI route is almost like the perfect solution. Now, it certainly wins on a lot of those types of things, and we should think about it. But if you think about it, the merging of the pots isn't an issue if it's all coming through PRSI.
I see a fair bit of head nodding. There seems to be quite a...
This is worrying when you have four economics people agreeing on something. We must be wrong.
Well, it's actually more worrying because I think I kicked it off and I'm not sure I believe in it totally. So there's sort of there's a runaway train here. No, but again, to come back to the PRSI, I mean, I think you can make a very plausible case for a marginal extension in the pension system. Through the PRSI system, taking on board, I think it was Liam pointed out, is that it's not necessarily the case that you're going to be charging, say, you know, PRSI on somebody on $250,000 or, you know, an amazing salary or whatever like that and trying to track that. But nevertheless, I think for a lot of the areas that we're concerned about, I just think there is an appeal. And again, as we were talking, I think it was Liam put up this question: should we have mandatory pensions? Well, of course we do have a mandatory system. It's the PRSI system, and so all we're talking about really is a sort of an extension of the existing system.
Well, you could even do it by the size of the employer, in the sense that, I mean, most large businesses will not have a problem administering an employer scheme in the normal way, whereas it's with the small companies. I mean, I know you're getting a lot of complaints about it, but I sympathise actually with the complaints. If I was running a construction firm with 20 people and you suddenly told me I need to bring in an employer pension and I need to have a trustee and all of this type of stuff, I think that's a lot to be asking people.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I just pick up on the precarious work point, which is interesting? If those workers, that's becoming more and more common.
Yeah, and the 0 hours,
the 0 hours, low hours, and whatever, and low pay. Yeah. The way we structure our PRSI system, which pays for the state pension at the tail end, or is paying it along the way, is that the contribution rates are quite low for low-paid workers and indeed for employers at low rates as well. And if we are going to see that sector of the economy expanding, and in a sense, if there's a bill there that needs to be paid in terms of paying pensions now or in the future to those individuals, that would point towards the fact that probably, which is where Ireland is out of sync a bit, we would need to be collecting more in social insurance, both from employees and from employers. So both would have to pay more for these quite good benefits that they would get in the future as well. Again, it's back to my point that nothing's
Andrew,
for free.
do you want to just add?
Maybe just to add on the smaller employer and being a trustee, we'd be very, very conscious of that. So it would be our intention that to see our view that you would have larger multi-employer trusts with maybe professional trustees offering those services for hundreds and thousands of smaller employers, rather than the current system, which is based on the employer, which makes it very, very difficult for small employers to have the expertise and the time and the money. So certainly it's looking at changing the system into larger schemes generally, and certainly in an auto-enrolment context, we in the authority don't want to supervise another 160,000 schemes, that's for sure.
Alan, I think you want to say something about the question about the constitutional amendment. Do you?
Oh, just very, very briefly. Okay, so I think the question was on the first one is that should there be a saying that you can't raid pension funds. Yes. I suppose the problem with it is essentially the pension fund tax was a form of wealth tax. Okay, when you think about it, that's what it was. And the question then arises, well, what makes pensions different from other forms of wealth? And so if you're almost going down a route of sort of saying that there shouldn't be any sort of a wealth tax, and I mean, I think that sort of raises a host of sort of philosophical issues, but it raises a very practical issue that if you take something like the local property tax in Ireland, I mean, again, that's a tax on the fact that you're a homeowner, you have a home. That's a wealth tax. So if you were going to try and have a constitutional amendment abolishing or prohibiting one form of wealth tax, I think then you'd have to others will come in, and I think it could get very complicated.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I think we've used up our time, and we're really, really grateful to our four speakers. And will you illustrate that gratefulness, please? It really has been a most helpful day, and the papers are really, really worthwhile. And you're sick of listening to me say this, but you should read the papers, please. Thank you very much. And we're going to start again at 1:45. So quick lunch.